Georg Hegel, Philosophy of Mind. Section 1, Mind Subjective. Subsection 387. Mind, on the ideal stage of its development, is mind as cognitive. Cognition, however, being taken here not as a merely logical category of the mind, section 223, but in the sense appropriate to the concrete mind. Subjective mind is a. Immediate or implicit, a soul, the spirit in nature, the object treated by anthropology. B. Mediate or explicit, still as identical reflection into itself and into other things. Mind in correlation or particularization. Consciousness, the object treated by the phenomenology of mind. C. Mind defining itself in itself as an independent subject, the object treated by psychology. In the soul is the awakening of consciousness. Consciousness sets itself up as reason, awaking at one bound to the sense of its rationality. And this reason, by its activity, emancipates itself to objectivity and the consciousness of its intelligent unity. For an intelligible unity of or principle of comprehension, for an intelligible unity or principle of comprehension, each modification it presents is an advance of development. And so in mind, every character under which it appears is a stage in the process of specification and development, a step forward towards its goal, in order to make itself into and to realize in itself what it implicitly is. Each step, again, is itself such a process, and its product is that what the mind was implicitly at the beginning. And so the observer, it is for itself, for the special form vis-a-vis which the mind has in that step. The ordinary method of psychology is to narrate what the mind or soul is, what happens to it, what it does. The soul is presupposed as a ready made agent which displays such features as its acts and utterances, from which we can learn what it is, what sort of faculties and powers it possesses, all without being aware that the act and utterance of what the soul is really invested with that character in our conception and makes it reach a higher stage of being than it explicitly had before. We must, however, distinguish and keep apart from the progress here studied what we call education and instruction. The sphere of education is the individual's only, and its aim is to bring the universal mind to exist in them. But in the philosophic theory of mind, mind is studied as self instruction and self education in very essence, and its acts and utterances are stages in the process which brings it forward to itself, links it in unity with itself, and so makes it actual mind. Subsection A, Anthropology, the soul. Subsection 388, Spirit, mind, came into being as the truth of nature, but not merely is it, as such a result, to be held the true and real first of what went before, This becoming or transition bears in the sphere of the notion the special meaning of free judgment. Mind thus come into being, there means therefore that nature in its own self realizes its untruth and sets itself aside. It means that mind presupposes itself no longer as the universality which is corporal. Individuality is always self externalized. Again, it means that mind presupposes itself no longer as the universality, which in corporal individuality is always self externalized, but as a universality which in its concretion and totality is one and simple. At such a stage, it is not yet mind, but soul. Subsection 389. The soul is no separate immaterial entity. Wherever there is nature, the soul is its universal immaterialism, its simple ideal life. Soul is the substance or absolute basis of all the particularizing and individualizing of mind. It is in the soul that mind finds the material on which its character is wrought, and the soul remains the pervading, identical ideality of it all. But as it is still conceived thus abstractly, the soul is only the sleep of mind, the passive nous of Aristotle, which is potentially all things. The question of the immaterial of the soul has no interest, except where, on the one hand, is regarded as something true, and mind conceived as a thing on the other. But in modern times, even the physicists have found matters grow thinner in their hands. They have come upon imponderable matters like heat, light, and so on, to which they might perhaps add space and time. These imponderables, which have lost the property peculiar to matter of gravity and, in a sense, even the capacity of offering resistance, have still, however, a sensible existence and outness of part to part, whereas the vital matter, which may also be found enumerated among them, not merely lacks gravity, but even every other aspect of existence which might lead us to treat it as material. The fact is that the idea of life, the self externalism of nature, is implicitly at an end. Subjectivity is the very substance and conception of life. With this proviso, however, that its existence or objectivity is still at the same time forfeited to the sway of self externalism, it is otherwise with mind. There, in the intelligible unity which exists as freedom, as absolute negativity, and not as the immediate or natural individual, the subject or the reality of the intelligible unity is the unity itself. And so the self externalism, which is the fundamental feature of matter, has been completely dissipated and transmuted into universality, or the subjective ideality of the conceptual unity. Mind is the existent truth of matter, the truth that matter itself has no truth. A cognate question is that of the community of soul and body. This community, interdependence, was assumed as a fact, and the only problem was how to comprehend it. The usual answer, perhaps, was to call it an incomprehensible mystery. And indeed, If we take them to be absolutely antithetical and absolutely independent, they are as impenetrable to each other as one piece of matter to another, each being supposed to be found only in the pores of the other, in essence, whether the other is not, in essence, where the other is not. Whence Epicurus, when attributing to the gods a residence in the pores, was consistent in not imposing on them any connection with the world. A somewhat different answer has been given by all philosophers since this realization came to be expressly discussed. Descartes, Malebranche, Spinoza, and Leibniz have all indicated God as this nexus. They meant that the finitude of soul and matter were only ideal and unreal distinctions, and so holding, these philosophers took God, not as so often is done, merely as another word for the incomprehensible, but rather as the sole true identity of finite mind and matter. But either this identity, as in the case of Spinoza, is too abstract, or, as in the case of Leibniz, though his monad of monads brings things into being, it does so only by an act of judgment or choice. Hence, with Leibniz, the result is a distinction between soul and the corporal or material, and the identity is only like the copula of a judgment, and does not rise or develop into a system, and does not rise or develop into system into absolute syllogism. Section 390. The soul is at first a, in its immediate natural mode, the natural soul which only is. B. Secondly, it is a soul which feels, as individualized, enters into correlation with its immediate being, and in the modes of that being retains an abstract independence. C. Thirdly, its immediate being or corporeity is molded into it, and with the corporeity it exists as actual soul. A. The physical soul. Natürlich Seele. Subsection 391. The soul universal. Described, it may be, as an anima mundi, a world soul, must not be fixed on that account as a single subject. It is rather the universal substance which has its actual truth only in individuals and single subjects. Thus, when it presents itself as a single soul, it is a single soul which is merely. Its only mode are modes of natural life. These have, so to speak, behind its ideality a free existence. In essence, they are natural objects for consciousness, but objects to which the soul as such does not behave as to something external. These features rather are physical qualities of which it finds itself possessed. Alpha, physical qualities, natürliche Qualitäten, subsection 392. While still a substance, in essence, a physical soul, the mind, number one, takes part in the general planetary life, feels the difference of climates, the changes of the seasons, and the periods of the day, and so on. This life of nature, for the main, shows itself only in occasional strain or disturbance of mental tone. In recent times, a good deal has been said of the cosmical, sidereal, and telluric life of man. In such a sympathy with nature, the animals essentially live. Their specific characters and their particular phases of growth depend, in many cases completely, and always more or less upon it. In the case of man, these points of dependence lose importance, just in proportion to his civilization, and the more his whole frame of soul is based upon a substructure of mental freedom. The history of the world is not bound up with revolutions in the solar system, and more than the destinies of individuals with the positions of the planets. The difference of climate has a more solid and vigorous influence, but the response to the changes of the seasons and hours of the day is found only in faint changes of mood, which come expressly to the fore only in morbid states, including insanity, and at periods when the self conscious life suffers depression. In nations less intellectually emancipated, which therefore live more in harmony with nature, we find amid the superstitions and aberrations of imbecility a few real cases of such sympathy, and on that foundation what seems to be marvelous prophetic vision of coming conditions and of events arising therefrom. But as mental freedom gets a deeper hold, even these few and slight susceptibilities based upon participation in the common life of nature disappear. Animals and plants, on the contrary, remain forever subject to such influences. Subsection 393 and number 2 under alpha of physical qualities. According to the concrete differences of the terrestrial globe, the general planetary life of the nature governed mind specializes itself and breaks up into several governed minds, which, on the whole, give expression to the nature of the geographical continents and constitute the diversities of race. Again, according to the concrete differences of the terrestrial globe, the general planetary life of the nature governed mind specializes itself and breaks up into the several nature governed minds, which, on the whole, give expression to the nature of geographical continents and constitute the diversities of race. The contrast between the Earth's poles, the land towards the North Pole being more aggregated and preponderant over sea, whereas in the southern hemisphere it runs out in sharp points, widely distant from each other, introduces into the differences of continents a further modification which Trevrianus, Biology Part 2, has exhibited in the case of the flora and fauna. Subsection 394. This diversity descends into specialities that may be termed local minds, shown in the outward modes of life and occupation, bodily structure and disposition, but still more in the inner tendency and capacity of the intellectual and moral character of the several peoples. Back to the very beginnings of natural history, we see the several nations, each possessing a persistent type of its own. Subsection 395 and number 3 under physical qualities. The soul is further deuniversalized into the individualized subject. But this subjectivity is here only considered as a differentiation and singling out of the modes which nature gives. We find it as the special temperament, talent, character, physiognomy, or other disposition and idiosyncrasy of families or single individuals. Subsection A, anthropology, the soul. Beta, physical alterations. Subsection 396. For those following on with the classifications here, the subsections are part of an entire encyclopedia, which began, I believe, with the philosophy of logic, and they're numbered from there. So the philosophy of mind or phenomenology of mind and the soul begins in the late 300s. Then there are other subdivisions. It may be helpful if you can to view the physical book to see if you like. Otherwise, this is just every philosopher has a division process to help, in this case, usefully help the mind order itself and to know where, in the science of Scientology or Dianetics, to help the file clerk, as he's called, to know where to place certain information. And so here we are in part one, subsection A, anthropology of the soul, and Greek letter beta, physical alterations. And the greater work, we're still under subsection 396. And then within the subsections, you'll have under Greek letter beta, physical alterations, 1, 2, 3. So if you are a file clerk yourself, you're appreciated. If you're taking notes, I would say the subsection numbered 396 it's important to know where you can find this information in the book. Whereas subsection A, anthropology, the soul, beta, physical alterations, 1, 2, so on, are another way of arranging your notes if you're only listening for Hegel's philosophy or phenomenology of mind, then to create a useful outline for your course, I would ignore the subsection with the 3-digit number and only focus on the one with the Greek letter and the numbers under it. So that is my take on it. I'm going to name them all because other people may just be curious about this section of the encyclopedia and go back to the logic to know where it fits in. The logic informs this section, though if you've had logic, and I've studied personally Aristotelian logic and epistemology, it seems that it is better to start here. And then others may want to go back who don't have a background in logic to the Hegel's earlier logic. Okay, subsection A, part 1, subsection A, anthropology, the soul, Greek letter beta, physical alterations. Within the Great Encyclopedia, subsection 396, taking the soul as an individual, we find its diversities, as alterations in it, the one permanent subject, and as stages in its development, as they are at once physical and mental diversities. A more concrete definition or description of them would require us to anticipate an acquaintance with the formed and matured mind. The beta physical alteration, number 1. First of these is the natural lapse of the ages in man's life. He begins with childhood, mind wrapped up in itself. His next step is the fully developed antithesis, the strain and struggle of a universality which is still subjective as seen in ideals, fancies, hopes, ambitions, against his immediate individuality. And that individuality marks both the world which, as it exists, fails to meet his ideal requirements, and the position of the individual himself, who is still short of independence and not fully equipped for the part he has to play, youth. Thirdly, we see man in his true relation to his environment, recognizing the objective necessity and reasonableness of the world as he finds it, a world no longer incomplete, but able in the work which it collectively achieves to afford the individual a place and a security for his performance. By his share in this collective work, he first is really somebody, gaining an effective existence and an objective value, manhood. Last of all comes the finishing touch to this unity with objectivity, a unity which, while on its realist side, it passes into the inertia of deadening habit, on its idealist side gains freedom from the limited interests and entanglements of the outward present. Old age. Subsection A, Anthropology of the Soul, Greek letter beta, Physical Alterations. Number 2, under subsection 397. Next, we find the individual subject to a real antithesis, leading it to seek and find itself in another individual. This, the sexual relation, on a physical basis, shows on its one side subjectivity remaining in an instinctive and emotional harmony of moral life and love, and not pushing these tendencies to an extreme universal phase. In purposes political, scientific, or artistic, and on the other, shows an active half, where the individual is the vehicle of a struggle of universal and objective interests with the given conditions, both of his existence and of that of the external world, carrying out these universal principles into a unity with the world, which is his own work. The sexual tie acquires its moral and spiritual significance and function in the family. Beta, subsection 3, under the Encyclopedia, subsection 398. When the individuality or self centralized being distinguishes itself from its mere being, this immediate judgment is the waking of the soul, which confronts its self absorbed natural life, in the first instance, as one natural quality and state confronts another, viz., sleep. The waking is not merely for the observer, or externally distinct from the sleep. It is itself the judgment, primary partition of the individual soul, which is self existing only as it relates its self existence to its mere existence, distinguishing itself from its still undifferentiated universality. The waking state includes generally all self conscious and rational activity in which the mind realizes its own distinct self. Sleep is an invigoration of this activity, not as a merely negative rest from it, but as a return back from the world of specialization, from dispersion into phases where it has grown hard and stiff, a return into the general nature of subjectivity, which is the substance of those specialized energies and their absolute master. The distinction between sleep and waking is one of those posers, as they may be called, which are often addressed to philosophy. Napoleon, His Majesty, ergo, on a visit to the University of Pavia, but this question to the class of ideology. Napoleon, ergo, on a visit to the University of Pavia, put this question to the class of ideology. The characterization given in the section is abstract. It primarily treats waking merely as a natural fact, containing the mental element implicit but not yet as invested with a special being of its own. If we are to speak more concretely of this distinction in fundamentals, it remains the same. We must take the self existence of the individual soul in its higher aspects as the ego of consciousness and as intelligent mind. The difficulty raised anent the distinction of the two states properly arises only when we also take into account the dreams in sleep and describe these dreams, as well as the mental representations in the sober waking consciousness, under one and the same title of mental representation. Thus, superficially classified as states of mental representation, the two coincide because we have lost sight of the difference. And in the case of any assignable distinction of waking consciousness, we can always return to the trivial remark that all this is nothing more than mental idea. But the concrete theory of the waking soul in its realized being, views it as consciousness and intellect. And the world of intelligent consciousness is something quite different from a picture of mere ideas and images. The latter are in the main only externally conjoined, in an unintelligent way, by the laws of the so called association of ideas. Though here and there, of course, logical principles may also be operative. But in the waking state, man behaves essentially as a concrete ego, an intelligence. And because of this intelligence, his sense perception stands before him as a concrete totality of features in which each member, each point, takes up its place as at the same time determined through and with all the rest. Thus, the facts embodied in his sensation are authenticated not by his mere subjective representation and distinction of the facts as something external from the person, but by virtue of the concrete interconnection in which each part stands with all parts of this complex. The waking state is the concrete consciousness of this mutual cooperation, of each single factor, of its content by all the others in the picture as perceived. The consciousness of this interdependence need not be explicit and distinct. Still, this general setting to all sensations is implicitly present in the concrete feeling of self. In order to see the difference of dreaming and waking, we need only keep in view the Kantian distinction between subjectivity and objectivity of mental representation, the latter depending upon determination through categories, remembering, as already noted, that what is actually present in the mind need not be, therefore, explicitly realized. In consciousness, just as little as the exaltation of the intellectual sense to God need stand before consciousness in the shape of proofs of God's existence. Although, as before explained, these proofs only serve to express the net worth of content of that feeling. End of Greek letter beta.